To ease your mind, I am in Utah, but not of Utah. So I'm not here to come and talk to you and say, hi, I'm from Utah, I'm going to tell you how to teach undergraduates history. That's not a way to start a presentation like this. I am of Brooklyn. And to be precise, 8 miles south of here, at what used to be Shore Road Hospital off the Belt Parkway, facing Staten Island. Born there, and then my parents drove me 2.5 miles east to the Belt Parkway exit that's called Bay Parkway. You know where that is? And you take that up a couple of blocks and you get to 86th Street, and that's the neighborhood I grew up in. So I'm delighted to be back here with many New Yorkers. The other good news for you, I think, I started in this work as a skeptic. I didn't believe any of this. And the first meeting I was brought to, it was a national meeting in Chicago where a whole group of European tuners had come over to introduce the topic to US faculty. It was going in one ear and out the other, and I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't figure out what was in this for me and my colleagues, why any of us should care. But something's changed, folks, for me. And I don't know, it's horrible to use this kind of language, especially at St. Francis College. It's a conversion experience. Because I started to figure out how many questions and problems this process started to answer. And it did so in very commonsensical terms. It did so with a respect for the academic freedom of myself and my colleagues. It did so with an understanding that historians need to be proactive in the kind of questions that Jim Grossman introduced to you this morning. None of us can sit here and say that questions defining our discipline, justifying our discipline, explaining questions about the accountability of our discipline is somebody else's job. It's your job. And those questions are not going away. I know every one of you has been doing more with less, especially since the Great Recession. That's the case at every campus. But I'm going to ask you to think about these tuning issues. I want to talk about how I introduced it in one department, not as the example of what to do. Not as a model of what to do, just as one example that worked on a particular campus with a particular student body in particular circumstances, and sit back and just reflect on this. What might all of this mean for my campus and my student body and my faculty and my particular institutional circumstances? And all of this stuff, I'll pass on this PowerPoint to Elaine and Eric and Sarah and everybody who's put the conference together. And hopefully they could just put it on some kind of website and just take it off if you want to, okay? Show of hands. Just curious about this. How many of you, just a show of hands, how many of you would say, I have a pretty good sense of what tuning is about? Okay, that's great. That's great. Because I was told, put beginners in the title. And think about the ways you can discuss this issue on a campus. Again, like I have to tell you, the kinds of questions we're all facing in post-secondary education, no matter where we are. You know the long list of issues and the long list of agenda that are out there. The access agenda. Who has access to post-secondary education? How well prepared are students for post-secondary education? What the hell this nation's going to do about a problem of student debt so that a recession may eventually have some kind of end? And that the people who should be beginning careers and spending money can finally have some disposable income. How do we deal with questions of transfer with a new body, with a new student body that we're going to be facing that you're already facing far more than I am in northern Utah. The completion agenda. How many of our students get through? With an associate's degree, with a bachelor's degree. What happens to them afterwards? Where do they go after they're with us? How are universities managing the whole issue of instruction? The declining number of tenure-track professors, the rapidly expanding and alarming expansion of contingent, and the conditions under which contingents work. What kind of pedagogy works? With the diverse student body that we find, with the expectations that students bring in, maybe with the impatience that many students have. Here's another question, and for those of you who aren't aware of this, it's quite a shocker. What's the meaning of a degree? You know, those pieces of paper you hand out when students finish at your 2-year and 4-year institutions. What does that degree mean? Are you putting together a bunch of numbers? This is the GPA that the student achieved. These are the required courses that the student finished. This is the curriculum that the student had all these check boxes on. Is that what a degree means? Is there something more to this degree? How do we state this? And how do we state it in a world that the Carnegie Foundation announced in December of 2012? Look if you can see that statement. The credit hour has reigned supreme for more than a century. As higher education's prevailing unit of measure, now its creator is asking whether it deserves to remain on the throne. Because the credit hour grew out of a way to create pensions for university professors. It's a time measurement system, and it involved our retirement. But what does the credit hour mean for us with a degree? How many of us think, yeah, the whole degree? How many students think, whole degree? 120 credits, I did it, I got a degree. Really? That's all there is to it, those numbers? Everybody in this room knows that there's far more to it, and that the key we're interested in is the learning that that degree stands for, and the skills and proficiencies that that degree stands for. And yeah, I have to use that horrible A word that Jim started out using this morning. These kinds of issues, debt, access, completion, you name it, the credit hour, it means we have to reassess our work. And I'll repeat what Jim said. The work is ours to do. You don't want non-historians assessing the meaning, the values, the goals, the contributions of historical study. And I came in as a skeptic to this kind of project because of what past assessment projects were all about. And they stunk. They were awful. And I didn't have a colleague who had anything invested in them. Because past assessment projects at the universities I'd been part of, I taught for a while at Purdue, and then I came to Utah State, 2 land-grant universities, public, large. They were always top-down approach. Some administrator in some office had announced that he or she understood what assessment is all about. And there was one form, one way to approach this. Who cared about the discipline? It was one size fits all. And faculty were just told, do this. And we did these assessment plans isolated from the rest of the world. We literally shut the doors. It was just faculty talking to faculty. And somebody in some office collected all kinds of paper that showed what we had talked about. And we all became like Elmer Fudd. One day, this evil assessor will find another job, and they'll leave us alone, and we can go back to the things we love doing. Being with students, doing our research. Just be quiet, and all this will go away. It makes a difference to be aware of what our key professional society is trying to help us with. And this article from Perspectives goes back to March of 2008 from a former president of the AHA, Gabrielle Spiegel. And back in March of 2008, she gave a warning to historians. You'd better be ready for this AAA threat of accountability, assessment, and accreditation. And the purpose of our article, small essay, you can look it up on the website. Point 1, assessment's here to stay. It's not just that one administrator who is pushing this down your throat. It's part of our life in post-secondary education. 2, who else but historians should respond to this? You don't trust administrators to answer questions about our work? Why would you leave this question with them? Isn't this part and parcel of your work, not only in educating your students and figuring out how you educate your students in the best possible way, but how we engage in education as part of professional development? Assessment, accreditation, accountability, it's all part of our work. It's part of our work not only as practitioners of history. You know what my goal for this meeting is? For you to leave here at 3:30 as advocates for history, who bring back messages to your campus, who start conversations with colleagues, and who maybe even get together with others and start talking to administrators. That question about, well, I'm jumping ahead here, how well do we define the learning that our program, that our degrees instill in students? How well do we do that? How well do students understand these goals? How well do their parents understand them? If you're at a public institution, policymakers, employers, do you even know who the employers of your students are? When do students come to this understanding? In their senior year when they have a cap and gown on? Do they have some sense of these questions about the learning we want to instill when they enter a program? Not a full sense. Do they get some general idea of what our discipline is about? And I don't care what institution you're in. If you're at a 4-year institution, how well do your colleagues at 2-year institutions know this? If you're a 2-year, how well do your colleagues in K through 12 understand this? We ought to be a wide community of historians talking about these issues at multiple levels in the U.S. educational system. These are all the questions addressed by tuning. This is why I hope it makes a difference to you. And why you can see that you and your colleagues and your discipline, they all have a vested interest in the way we answer these questions. And it's not complex. Is tuning a form of assessment? Yeah, okay, you want to use that word? And the word, oh my goodness. The words that surround this whole project can be frightening. Assessment, outcomes, rubrics, God, you name it. People get chills up and down their spines. It's not the vocabulary we use. It's not. You're not comfortable with it? Find some other terms. The most important point about tuning that separates it from other projects of assessment of different disciplines is the informing question behind all of it. And folks, this is such a commonsensical question, but it's a real puzzler. Here it is. When students complete a program of study in history, What should they know, understand, and be able to do? Can anyone in this room sit here and tell me that that's an unreasonable question to ask? That this is some kind of conspiratorial question? That we ought to be frightened about coming to an answer to this question? Or that we ought to let non-historians answer that question? You want to deal with accountability and assessment and the accreditation issues we all have to face? Why don't you start with that question? Come up with the answer. And it's not going to be easy. It's going to take a lot of patient discussion. And you ought to do this with as wide a community of people as possible. But that's the essence of tuning. If you don't start there, you're missing the boat on this whole project. You want one takeaway point from today? Take away the question. Stare out a window and try to figure out an answer. That's what you're doing. You're not holding trade secrets. You're not the great and powerful Oz. You're not standing behind a curtain with lots of flames going around, scaring lions and scarecrows. You're making explicit the implicit. What is the purpose of making your students continually guess at the answers to these questions? What is the purpose of that? A second distinguishing point about tuning in the whole world of assessment, and the reason it's different from other programs, and it's our European colleagues who helped us form this. It's a bottom-up approach. It doesn't start with administrators. It starts with faculty. It starts with the discipline experts announcing what their discipline is all about. Third distinctive feature. It's discipline specific. It's not a one-size-fits-all form of assessment. What's critical in your discipline, in physics, in chemistry, in nursing? That's what shapes the whole process. Not one form that everybody fills out the same way. The focus is not simply on pieces of knowledge that are going to allow you to get to a championship round in Jeopardy. The focus is on the knowledge and the skills, the proficiencies, the awkward term for many of us in history, the learning outcomes in our discipline. What else separates this from other assessment schemes that you may have been exposed to before? Whatever we state about our discipline has to be stated for a general audience. And one of the great points of pride in our discipline is the pride we take in our communication ability. Our ability to speak to different audiences and to frame arguments in scores of ways. If we're giving a paper at the AHA conference, we know how to state a problem. We know what our colleagues in the audience expect. If we're asked to go to a public library and speak to the public about a complex historical issue, we know how to frame it for that audience. Keep those communication skills in mind. What you want to do is figure out the answer to that great question about history and pose it in language that a broad spectrum of audiences can understand, not just specialists. Think about this at different degree levels. What should a student know, understand, and be able to do when they finish an associate's degree? What should a student know, understand, and be able to do when they finish a bachelor's degree? One way you do this is what you just did. You sit face to face with your colleagues. You break bread with them. Fortunately, almost all of us learn good manners at the dinner table. You got to treat others with respect. You got to be calm. You got to listen. Meet face to face. Don't do it over Skype. Don't do it through emails. Have a sandwich in front of you. and just talk. And work with colleagues at as many different institutions as possible. Look, for many of you, it's going to be tough enough at your own institution, okay? You got to be patient with this. But don't stop there. And don't just talk to faculty. Talk to students, alumni, administrators, employers. You're at a public institution, talk to policymakers. Ask them open questions. Don't give them don't give them a PowerPoint. Just talk to them. What's on their mind? What do they expect from post-secondary education? What are their aspirations? This is another distinctive part of the assessment that tuning offers. And from Europe to other parts in the world where tuning's been adopted. There's a Tuning Africa project, there's a Tuning Latin America project, there's a Tuning Russia project, there is a Tuning China project. I'm heading over in September to help kick off a Tuning Japan project. No matter where this project comes to be formed, there's a commitment that rests at the center of it. None of this is meant to create standardization and uniformity in higher education. All of it is meant to preserve the diversity and autonomy of different programs and institutions. But come back to, in your discipline, what Jim talked to you about this morning. Reference points. Think about this issue for us globally. What links historians in the US with historians in the EU, with historians in Latin America, with historians in Africa, with historians in Russia, historians in China, and other areas? You should be going to the AHA National Convention. You have no excuse in January. It's in Manhattan. I'm coming for Utah, for God's sake. I'm going to be there. You should be there. And by the way, come to my panel. Because the panel is on the global tuning discussion. It's going to be a historian from the University of Pisa who's going to talk about tuning in the EU. I've got a colleague from Colombia who's going to talk about historical tuning Latin America. There's going to be a colleague from Indiana University who's going to be putting this in the framework of the literature on teaching and learning. The global discussion among historians about tuning. This is something else that sets apart tuning from other assessment projects. And finally, the last thing I would ever say about my institution is that we've tuned in the past tense. That's one word to get out of your vocabulary. Keep it in the present participle. We're tuning. Just like our discipline is constantly evolving, asking new questions about old information, also finding new information about the past, this is an open-ended process. Have you been stung by assessment in the past? I have. I'll bet you have. I promise you, this process is different. I promise you it's worth the effort. That's my campus. Do you know that is what my campus looks like? If, one, you're in a helicopter. Two, it's June 27th. Three, it's 8:30 p.m. and the sun is setting in the west, just at a certain angle. And that the building with the big A, right, that's the building I get to work in. I'm the luckiest guy in the world to be with the colleagues I'm with at a place that's this breathtaking to look at. You can't believe the view I have from my parking lot. I look out 25 miles over mountains and valleys. It's unbelievable. Tuning came to Utah in 2009. We were just one of, along with 7 other public institutions in the state. Look, folks, it ain't New York, I know that. Brooklyn to Logan, Utah. It's traveling not only through space, but trust me, through time. The state only has 2.5 million people, 8 public institutions. But this place, we've got about 29,000 students altogether. It's huge. We came to tuning, and the year it came, the state had a grant to launch into this project. I was acting department head, and I had to start this discussion among my colleagues. Those of you who have been department heads or acting department heads, you know, this is a god-awful assignment. And then somebody tells you, oh yeah, you got to start this assessment project. I just want to give you some suggestions on what happened on our campus and some lessons I learned that, again, this is not a model, just some things to keep in the back of your mind. And this is the most important one. You start with people where they are, not where you want them to be. This suggestion comes to us from colleagues in Manhattan, an organization called Public Agenda that does one hell of a great job of facilitating discussions like these. You recognize where people are, and you recognize in tuning in particular how people have been burned by or turned off by assessment projects in the past. And for me, as an acting head, all of this began, look at that year, 2008-9. That's when the Great Recession started to hit campus budgets. It started earlier, but we know what happened if you were on a campus in the late summer of 2008. Guess what kind of questions were on the minds of my colleagues? Am I going to have a job? And I'm sitting there with the budgets in my hand, and I've got to make these damn decisions. I actually wound up with a bunch of small strokes. I couldn't deal with these kinds of issues and my colleagues. That year, I've got to get people interested in assessment. And, there was also an administrative order. A dean came into the college claiming to be an expert on assessment. And it was a top-down approach. It was one size fits all. It was faculty talking to faculty and nobody else. It was all the things that were wrong with assessment in the past. And I told the new appointee, I said, could I be excused from this? Because the state office has asked me to engage in a different process. And gratefully, this administrator allowed me to do it. The plans that the administrator laid out, they died before the year was over. And I introduced this to faculty in our seminar room with a lunch in front of people so they could be chewing and trying to be gracious during dinner, but all hell broke loose. And it was just one complaint after another. And it was basically complaints based on people's past experience with assessment. They were so angry at the time they felt had been wasted on these projects. And at a moment when there was such an economic crisis in our department and others, they could not figure out for the life of them why anybody should spend 2 minutes on this. So a colleague, a Latin American specialist that I respect enormously, just raised his hands and said, you know what, just tell them we do critical thinking, sign the form, hand it in. And as Jim said, everybody at a university does critical thinking. What is it that we contribute to that process? The talk went round and round. The frustration went round and round. But I learned something. Let people whine. And I found this in more than one situation. Let faculty complain. And within about 12 to 15 minutes, they get sick of it. And somebody starts to suggest solutions. Give it a try. I mean, you got to be so patient. You got to sit there and just, I guess it helps to do yoga, something. Let the wine fest begin. And watch and wait to listen to the solutions that people come up with. What's the great thing that happened in our department? Everybody came to agreement on one complaint. We were doing a miserable job preparing our students at a 4-year institution for their senior capstone course. We were preparing them to fail. Oh. In what ways? That's my question. Well, they can't do this, they can't do this, they can't do this. Oh. Where can we fit that into the curriculum where they will learn that? Start at the end point and work backwards. What do we do from the survey course to the upper division course to the capstone course? And suddenly, a plan starts to take shape. This was our starting point, the end. For others, again, it's just an example. It actually worked. But despite this, one of the key points about tuning is you should learn it's a cultural change. It's a shift in the way we think about our work, our responsibilities as researchers, as teachers, and as advocates. And none of this happens in one semester. It's an ongoing process. Don't start with a blank piece of paper. Attention department. What is it that students should know, understand, and be able to do? Imagine yourself sitting at that meeting. What would you think? Get some guidance. We did. We had to look to Europe for guidance on this with another source too. We borrowed from colleges around the world, especially from our colleagues in the EU, UK colleagues who had gone through this process. Wow, Australian colleagues, holy cow, did they create some great documents. They really are terrific. And this is 2008-9. We started plunging into the literature of the AHA. Here's the plug for the AHA. Folks, we need a voice of advocacy in our profession. And you can help in that process. Everybody who is attending this meeting is going to get an email sent to you. And it's an invitation to join our professional society. Outlining these issues, trying to attract grant money to address these questions about assessment and accreditation and accountability, creating meaningful doctoral programs. Our organization can't do this without your support and your help. I'm begging you, don't toss out that email. Join and take advantage of the meeting that's coming up in January at the Hilton up on 53rd and Avenue of the Americas. Participate in this group. We got so much information, not the stuff at the top, because that's come lately, but I did by plunging back into issues of perspectives on history and the multiple pamphlets that our organization has created on teaching and learning. Pamphlets like these that you can find on the AHA website. And now, the resources are even better. And folks, again, I'm just going to make this PowerPoint available to you. There are booklets about tuning in the US. There's a website called Tuning USA that explains the AHA project and other projects. There's even a new tuning journal that comes out of the University of Deusto in Spain, and it's edited by a colleague in Galway. Don't start on your own. Look at the way your colleagues around the world have answered questions about history. You know where to start? You go into your blue binder here, you pull out that history discipline core. What have your colleagues in the US been saying about all this? 3, I would suggest you try small steps. Don't go plunging into this full bore. Our department, and again, just an example. We started with some provisional learning outcomes, not only at our campus, but at 7 other public campuses with 7 other history departments in the state. I asked colleagues, could you do something on your syllabi? Put your name, put your hours, and the very start of it, could you just list your learning outcomes? What are you trying to achieve? I came up with some sample rubrics, guidelines for evaluating student exercises, exams, papers. Rather than giving a student a B- on an exam and a bunch of comments that most of them were never going to read, I built a kind of format. I asked myself, what the hell goes into an A on this exercise? And I just started a chart in terms of historical thinking, historical skills. I started to chart what it is that I'm looking for and tell students, you want an A on this? Here, read down column on the left. These are the goals you should be aiming for. You know what the most practical change in my life has been since I did that? It's office hours. Students come in. Are they upset? Yeah. What do they come in and say to me now? I don't know why the heck I got a B- on that. And they say heck because they're from Utah. I don't know why the heck I got a B- on this. I never got anything less than a B+ in high school. They don't ask that anymore because they can see on the rubric what they succeeded in and what they did poorly on. You know what the conversation in office hours has been like since 2009? I took this test. I saw 2 areas out of the 7 that you outlined that I did poorly on. How can I do better on those? Who wouldn't live for an office hour like that? We agreed to have one rubric for the capstone course. Whoever taught that capstone course, there was going to be one rubric we used to evaluate the final paper. And then we did something crazy, and I didn't even know what the hell that meant. We were advised do an inter-rater reliability study of the capstone. In other words, you taught the capstone course and you evaluated it on the rubric, give it to him, and he fills out a rubric. What happens with the evaluations? How close are they? We were stunned at how close our evaluations were. Yeah, we changed the intro survey. We created a pre-major. We looked across the, again, it's a big campus, we looked across the engineering to, oh God, all kinds of programs. And they all seemed to have all these requirements that students had to fulfill before they could announce that they were a major in the field. And we thought, why the hell don't we do that? If we don't have something like that, what in a sense are we saying to students? Oh, anybody can do history. So we decided, let's try something else. Let's start creating an intentional, sequenced curriculum for students. You know how you're going to succeed? And maybe, unbelievably, stop going into such debt? Why don't you start with some foundational courses in history and gen ed courses closely tied to the liberal arts? Complete those USU or competency courses. Finish all these and then start dabbling in upper division courses. We talked with lots of people outside the institution. Students, parents, alumni. Alumni were terrific. I wrote the letter to them, and the first line of the letter is, I'm not asking you for money. I just want to know how you feel about the program you graduated, the program from which you graduated. And people responded and also sent checks. Unbelievable. Figured out who the employers of our students are. I know that's an easier task in Utah than it is in the metropolitan area. We talked with policymakers. Even the policymaker in our state, the leader of the state senate, who declared on the floor, in public, before an audience, the humanities are a degree to nowhere. We collected letters from alumni. We did focus groups with different individuals. We gathered quite a bit of information about how people think about history, what they'd like to see in history courses. Talk to people outside of your department. You might want to look at this, for example, from the Association of American Colleges and Universities. It's easy to do a search for AACU more than a major. It's a survey they did last April. What do employers think about college students and college education? What do they want? Don't worry. Here's some of the things they want. Innovation, cutting across majors, the importance of a liberal education, applying skills. Maybe some of you do e-portfolios where students report on their own process and their own progress. What do employers want us to put more emphasis on? Look on the left. Critical thinking, analyzing, solving problems, effective oral communication, written communication. Do you find any of those items on the left offensive? Worrying? Don't you have confidence that our discipline works towards these ends? By the way, show this survey to students. Give them some clue on how to present themselves to employers if their next step is public or private sector employment. Take a look at what's going on at Georgetown. Anthony Carnevale's work in the Center on Education and the Workforce. Oh yeah, now look. Tuning wants you to have evidence for what you're claiming. Sorry. But why should this come as any surprise to historians? We are an evidence-based discipline. Unlike what many of our students hear on various, quote, news sources, we just don't invent things out of the past. We actually have to have evidence for it. You've got to figure out ways of building evidence for the learning outcomes that you and your colleagues choose to accept and endorse. And I don't mean a standardized test. But if you don't act on this, guess what we're all going to wind up with if we leave it to Arnie Duncan? You've got to be proactive and build yourself a basket of so-called metrics. I hate that word too. I'm sorry. What's your evidence? That students have reached certain goals, certain proficiency levels. Yeah, try some rubrics. Boy, look up these things. Look up e-portfolios on Google. Actually, go to Salt Lake Community College, e-portfolios. I'm so impressed by the job my colleagues have done at that two-year institution on this project. Rigorously tie your assignments to learning outcomes. Think carefully, critically, deeply about the assignments you offer in a class. You want to prevent standardized tests? Build the evidence on the exercises you have students do within your classes, and bring even more reflection to those assignments. I couldn't believe this. The university told me about some course management software. Oh, God. I was keeping grades on a yellow pad. And I started to find out what things like Moogle and what the hell is mine called? Canvas. What these systems can do for evaluation and record keeping. Look back on your course evaluation system at your institution. See if you can get anybody at your institution to think seriously about a course evaluation system called IDEA. IDEA. Because it allows you to focus on learning outcomes for your course, not personality. It allows all of us to write in the questions we want our students to answer. And we put in the questions drawn from our learning outcomes. It's a great body of evidence. And you know what else it helps in? If you're again, for those of you fortunate enough to have a tenure-track position, try to convince the chair of that committee. Use this as evidence in a T&P file. Jim said this before, it's important to repeat this. Give your students the vocabulary to explain what they've learned and developed as history students. Do many of you have a requirement sheet for your department? We do. It's always been a checklist for graduation. Do this, reach these grades, take these courses, check, 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 boom, you're a graduate. We've changed it around. All those other things still are there. We're trying to use the requirement sheet as a guideline for learning. One section of it deals with career opportunities for those that don't want to go on for further education. And this is what it states. It's just an attempt to give students the start with some language that they can use either in the public or private sector to talk about the skills they've developed as historians. Again, folks, I'll send you this stuff. Think about how you can do the same thing in a class. You have an exercise in a class. Do you go over it when you hand it back? Maybe take a few minutes to talk about the language students can use to explain the importance of this exercise to a variety of audiences. Don't run away from what makes you a distinctive institution. Don't think there is one standard that the AHA is promoting for all history departments in all parts of the U.S., regardless of their mission, their priorities, their student profile, their curriculum, their entry point, their majors, their interdisciplinary qualities, their evaluation systems, special resources on your campus, projects of civic and social engagement you might urge your students to or require your students to engage in. Think deeply and proudly about every point that distinguishes your university, your institution, and make it part of the tuning project. Oh, I'm not like a land-grant university. Thank God. Hold on to that diversity that your institution represents. What kind of learning outcomes do you develop when you consider these points? Here's what you're saying to your students, to your alumni, to employers, to policymakers. Here are the coherent learning goals that we have as a department, and here are the distinctive ways that we pursue these goals. Don't hide from that. You're thinking about the question, what should students know, understand, and be able to do? Think about a second question. What sets our institution apart? What do we do differently? Don't forget the advisors on your campus. The academic advisors, the career counselors. You have people who are in charge of introducing students to your campus. Get them in on the conversation. These are often the people who are introducing our discipline to students. And I've seen what happens when some of these people introduce history. Oh, God. We got to repair a lot of damage. Find a forum for your students to talk to students. Their success stories. What graduate program did they get into? What private sector employment did they get into? What public sector employment? I'll give you one example from a tuning colleague in the AHA. I believe it was Lendl Calder at Augustana. He said, yeah, I had a student who was a business major and a history major. And I was always trying to drag him into more history courses. This student was adamant. He wanted to get into the world of banking. So he did. He had 2 majors. He goes for a job interview. It's with, I think it's J.P. Morgan Chase. They're sitting there having an interview, the student's talking about his proficiencies. Somebody stops him in the middle of an interview. You're doing great. Just a suggestion. Next interview you go to, don't talk about yourself as a historian. Introduce yourself as an information analyst. You know what that's an example of? What Jim talked about this morning. Figure out the vocabulary that translates what we do in history into other fields of endeavor. And let your students talk to other students about this. We've got a bunch who are coming back to our campus in the fall. It's a meeting of our honor society, the Phi Alpha Theta. And one of the meetings is one meeting we're going to try to demystify graduate school. Another meeting, we're going to have graduates come back and talk about how they got into a graduate program, how they landed a private sector job, or how they landed a public sector job. Final point, prepare your elevator speech. You're riding an elevator up in a building. Oh my God, it's the provost. Where have you been? Well, I was down in Brooklyn. What were you doing there? Well, we're talking about tuning. You got 1 minute to talk to this guy before the door opens and he leaves. How are you going to talk to him about this project? Let me give you a suggestion. The AHA's tuning project asks all of us to clarify and demystify the core goals, the key skills we pursue in our discipline. We want to answer a basic question. Students complete a program, what should they know, understand, be able to do? We ask this question to understand our own roles and responsibilities in higher education. And we want our students to understand clearly what they take from their studies into employment, further education, and civic life. And stay tuned, because there's lots more coming. There'll be workshops on tuning at the January 2015 meeting up at the Hilton. There'll be sessions throughout the conference on this topic. Become a member of the AHA. Get copies of perspectives delivered to your mailbox, where there are constantly articles about this. Go to the Perspectives website. Look up past articles. Jim told you about the article by our colleague Ann Hyde, talking to parents. Look back also at a column from Jim, where he got a letter from a colleague who was extraordinarily critical of tuning. And Jim very thoroughly and politely, respectfully and thoughtfully responded to the critiques. Get a sense of not only how this system can work for us, get a realistic sense of the kind of objections that people are going to have, that maybe you're holding. See how this is played out in our profession. And use this, if for no other reason, that is as an important part of your own professional development. Understanding that the commitment that your professional society, the AHA, has to the importance, to the continued strength, and to the influence of history as a discipline, as a field of study, as an area of inquiry for men and women across the U.S. Thanks very much. I mean, there is a sense of what the Department of Education wants to put out and emphasize in statements about higher education. And one goal that we've heard about in advance, whether this is going to come to be a completed project or not, involves salaries of graduates. Salaries of graduates. God, this is so wrong on so many levels. I'll suggest something. Look, one, I share your concern about so much of the language of this project. And I'll be frank with you, when I talk about this whole project with my colleagues, the last word I use is tuning. We focus on questions of learning, goals. We talk about questions about our students' future. What's next? Basically 3 steps: further education, private sector employment, public sector employment. A lot of my students too, it's Utah. Some of them want to start families. Military service as well. You want a metric? Form a good exit survey for your graduates. The AHA is pleading with all of us. Gather information on where your students go, because this is one way that our professional society can fashion a meaningful, evidence-based argument about the kinds of paths that history students follow and the varied paths they follow. I tried this myself. I've tried it on SurveyMonkey, which is fun and it's free, and you're limited to 10 questions. So think about them carefully. And then all of a sudden I found out my institution bought a site license to something called Qualtrics, which is great. Wow, it's a great survey program. And I thought, geez, let me at least get some information about this. I'm not happy with what I built, and I should have asked some different questions, but it's a start. There's a metric. Where do your graduates go? A second metric. Jim said this before, a focus group with your students. What do they want? One question I'm trying to figure out, and I wish I knew a clearer answer to this, what do students at 2-year institutions want? What's their goal? This often comes up with the so-called completion agenda. We talk to employers in our state who employ history majors. And I wrote about this in the April issue of Perspectives. The number one point that they said they were interested in when they interviewed history graduates for public sector jobs that focused on historical skills, number one thing they were looking for, enthusiasm about their discipline. You know the irony of this? We've been talking about these 60 or so tuners who have been working with the AHA since 2012. One of the first critiques that came up at our initial meetings was a question that people like Patty Limerick asked. Where the hell is the role of passion? Where's the joy of inquiry? Where do we find this in our learning outcomes? You talk about a metric that's hard to measure. But we find out from employers that's exactly what they want. They want students who have had internships. They want students who have worked in team or collaborative projects in their history courses. And it forces us back to think, okay, geez, we're interested in our students, not just bodies in a classroom and student credit hour numbers. We're interested in them as human beings and their own success. What can we do in our courses to perhaps build team or collaborative projects for students that they can talk about when they go for an interview? And the most important point, helping students build a persuasive narrative about their educational experience. Give them the skill that we're all proud of having as historians, the ability to talk to different audiences at multiple levels, to be straightforward, to make evidence-based arguments, but to get through to others for whom our discipline vocabulary is arcane. Those are actually some metrics to work on. And all of this, I tell you, from the AHA to funding agencies for this, it's all an effort to avoid the trap of standardized tests. To come up with various pieces of evidence, and I mean a wide variety, to show what students know, understand, and are able to do. Folks, as you leave, as you think about what's happened today, some reflections come to your mind, please feel free to write to us, to Jim, to Julia, to me. If something's on your mind, something's troubling you about this, or there's a project you think we ought to be looking at, please let us know. We're constantly in communication with one another about this project. This isn't something where we just come together for a few conferences a year. And in fact, one reason why it's worthwhile to stay in touch with the discussion groups is on this sheet. Julia just posted this 2 days ago. The language that students can use to translate history skills into private sector employment skills. You know what? I only made 25 copies of this because I had to watch Delta luggage rules. But this is on the history tuning discussion group under Julia's name, and it's widely available. This thing is a hoot. It was written by a Canadian talking about the skills of historians.